Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to what the USA would look like today if the South won the Civil War. Now, I know very little about the Civil War because I'm not American, but from what I do know, I believe it was between the Confederates and the other side. I believe the Confederates wanted to keep slavery, I think. So had they won, you know, the USA would look entirely different, wouldn't it? But, you know, would there have been some concessions made? Like, what would their country actually have looked like?
Appomattox, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, battle-worn and exhausted, sit across from each other. Their faces are etched with the weight of a divided nation. The room is tense, every moment heavy with history. Then, with a single fateful pen stroke, they bring 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed to an end. The United States Civil War is over, and jubilant cheers rise from the men in gray. The Confederacy has won. How did this happen, and what comes now for the two nations that were now one? Find out on this episode of the Infographics Show, USA Today if the South won the Civil War. What if the South won the Civil War? It might just be the most popular alternate history hypothetical in the world. The question has fueled countless books, theories, and debates, and even a darkly satirical film called CSA, Confederate States of America. It depicted a horrific future where the South overran the North, re-legalized slavery nationwide, and created a country entirely based around human bondage. Fast forward 140 years, there is an America where slaves are sold on the Home Shopping Network. Was this disturbing future close to happening? In a word, no. While Southern war songs might have boasted about sweeping into Washington and hanging old Abe, it was really just a fantasy. The Confederate Army was primarily composed of draftees, lacked the resources of the federal government, and was focused on its own claimed territory. Despite surprising the North early in the war and even making bold forays into states like Pennsylvania, they were met with fierce resistance and bogged down at critical points. Any victory would have more likely resulted in their borders being recognized, not the stars and bars flying over the White House. But what about if someone else entered the fray? The Confederacy did make some moves to gain foreign allies, but success was limited. The British were no doubt still smarting from their 2 losses to the US and would love revenge, but they abolished slavery in 1834 and likely saw the Confederates as the worse option. France had also abolished slavery and was in the middle of a tumultuous century. It had little interest in involving itself in America's conflicts. Spain, while still maintaining colonies in the Americas, was situated too close to the Confederacy to be of real strategic help, which means the South's best bet was elections in the North. Abraham Lincoln loomed high in the public eye during the war, but he still had to win re-election in the middle of it. His opponent was his former general, George McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln and definitely held a grudge. While George McClellan was undoubtedly pro-Union, he was also deeply skeptical about the war's mounting costs. If he wins and the North faces setbacks, he might persuade the public it's better to let the South go than to keep shedding blood over slavery. And all of American history is different. So now what? Far more issues would have had to be settled immediately. Starting a new country isn't easy, and it's
plus splitting the country, you know, down that sort of line would weaken both of them financially in terms of the, well, I mean, would it though? Because, I mean, relative to the populations, the GDP would still be quite high. But the USA today, you know, the behemoth that it is just wouldn't be there.
It's especially hard when it's dividing an existing country in two. Among the first issues that would have to be settled is the border. There were countless families divided on both sides of the line. Imagine if grandma lives in Virginia and the rest of the family lives in Maryland. Over the river and through the woods is now a passport situation. And that's just the start of the new country's border troubles. The Confederacy had recently gained much of its territory before the war via the annexation of Texas from Mexico. This was a highly thorny issue that the Mexicans were still smarting over. So the Confederate States would now potentially be facing hostile borders on both sides and would no doubt be hoping to quickly establish diplomatic relations. Similar to when the US gained independence, the war ending doesn't mean another isn't around the corner. The US might be sorely tempted to back Mexico in an attempt to weaken the new potential enemy on their doorstep. But the Confederacy has one big ace up its sleeve. Why was the South so determined to keep slavery? It wasn't solely racism. It was far more useful to them than it would be in the North, thanks to their huge agricultural sector. Unlike the North, which could abolish slavery with minimal impact, the South relied on an enslaved labor to sustain its vast plantation system. With control over a significant portion of the continent's food supply, the South held a strong bargaining chip. With westward expansion underway, the North would likely push for trade agreements and border access.
So, isn't it crazy, the concept of actually owning another person? Like, you own that person, you control every aspect of their lives. Isn't that mad? At least to me it is.
Prompting immediate diplomatic talks. And if they succeeded would depend on one big factor: who was leading them. There was only one president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and he would serve for a 6-year term in this timeline. Davis was seen as a ruthless but pragmatic man who would likely have never been open to negotiations with his defeated rivals. But he couldn't run for re-election per the Confederate Constitution, which meant that someone new would hold the future in his hands. The victorious General Robert E. Lee would be a favorite, the same way Ulysses S. Grant was, but Lee was reportedly doggedly apolitical and might have declined to serve, which leaves a sharply forked path for the Confederacy. The Confederacy had some moderates high up, including Vice President Alexander Stephens, who initially advocated against secession and served as governor of Georgia after the war. And then there was Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederacy's Secretary of State and Attorney General at different points. Benjamin was seen as a canny negotiator and once proposed freeing slaves who fought for the Confederacy. Either one likely would have brought a more moderate touch to the new government, but it's not clear if either one could have won an election.
So it's sounding like even if the South had won, it wouldn't be this massively extreme, horribly sort of biased towards black and other minorities, people, landscape than that I thought it would be. It wouldn't be what it is now, but it definitely wouldn't be as bad as the society I was envisioning.
Especially since a far more fiery figure was waiting in the wings. At 36 years old, John C. Breckinridge was the youngest person ever to take the helm as Vice President of the United States, serving from 1857 to 1861. The fiery Kentuckian was picked by James Buchanan to appease angry Southerners, and he lived up to his reputation as the losing candidate against Abraham Lincoln. He immediately sided with the Confederacy and wound up being the Confederacy's last Secretary of War. As such, in this timeline, he would be seen as partially responsible for their upset victory and would likely be in pole position as a future president of the Confederacy. And that would likely lead to a lot of chaos for the Confederacy and everyone around them. With less than 20% of the people in the Confederacy owning slaves, slavery was largely a privilege of the wealthy elite, a point of pride for Confederate leadership, and they would likely lean into it under a Breckinridge presidency, causing them plenty of problems. Europe had abolished slavery decades ago, as had Canada and Mexico, making it more difficult for the new Confederacy to establish diplomatic relations. It would also potentially leave them at the mercy of their northern neighbor. And another issue could bring that crashing down and possibly even start the guns of war. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, one of the nastiest points of contention was fugitive slave patrols heading north to retrieve escaped slaves and drag them back to bondage. While they had the proper paperwork in some cases, many functioned like vigilante kidnapping gangs. And now that there's a border in place between the two nations, that's a much harder issue to resolve.
God, that just reminded me of that show, Repos, where they go and repossess cars. Imagine doing that for humans. It's completely fucked, honestly. The idea of it, honestly, gives me the creeps.
A slave escaping to the free United States could be a diplomatic incident if the U.S. refused to return them. And a slave patrol being caught trying to kidnap someone in another country would be a much bigger one. So it's likely both countries might start looking elsewhere. Initially, tensions between the U.S. and the Confederacy would likely be too high for much diplomacy beyond trade. Instead, the U.S. would probably strengthen its ties with Canada and Britain. With Canada gaining more autonomy in 1867, the time is actually perfect for closer relations and maybe even a partnership. The Confederacy, meanwhile, might find Florida its most appealing real estate. It's close to the Caribbean, where many islands are still under the thumb of other colonies, and it might allow for the expansion of slavery. But the odds are it wouldn't be long before the two countries clashed once again. The Civil War happened at the height of westward expansion, and there was plenty of territory still to claim and make into states. it would likely turn into a higher stakes version of the many territorial clashes in the lead-up to the Civil War. Neither country would have much hunger for another armed conflict at this point, so it's likely only minor skirmishes would happen. Eventually, a latitude line would determine where territories lay, so it's likely the states would definitely not form as they did in our timeline. But what about the people kept in bondage? Is there any hope for them? As slavery was swiftly being abolished worldwide, the Confederacy stood apart. Unlike other nations across the globe, the Confederacy's economy relied on agriculture, where enslaved labor cut costs significantly.
Wow. So they said in this video that the UK abolished slavery in like 1835. I mean, that sounds like a long time ago, but it's not really, is it? That's like just over 200 years ago, like 211 years. That's like 3 lifetimes ago. Like, that's not that long ago, is it? Wow.
Furthermore, slavery had become a point of pride, rooted in the very war fought to protect it. So odds are hardline presidents would bow to the plantation lobby and work to preserve it despite outside pressure. But there's gonna be a lot of that. The abolitionist movement was sweeping the world and viewed slavery with disgust. But it wasn't enough to get them to cut off relations with countries that still had it. But to start new relations with a country essentially built around it, that's a trickier question. The Confederacy would likely face swift diplomatic isolation. This would be especially true if the US, a key trading partner for many nations, pressured its allies to avoid working with those dirty Rebs on the southern border. So it's likely that, like it or not, change is coming to the Confederacy. While diplomatic pressure would hurt the Confederacy, odds are that another factor would work against slavery even more: industrialization. As plows were replaced with tractors and cotton pickers with threshers, the plantations would need fewer laborers and more machines operated by trained workers. Mass slavery would soon become unprofitable, but it's unlikely that the institution would be outlawed anytime soon. Wealthy landowners with house slaves would fight tooth and nail to keep them, insisting that Old Man Herbert's just part of the family and they couldn't possibly do without him. Meanwhile, Old Man Herbert—
They definitely modeled this guy on Samuel Jackson's character in Django Unchained. Like, the resemblance is uncanny.
Bert shoots daggers with his eyes behind them. But keeping slavery would set them up for trouble, and their future might look a lot like another country's. The vast majority of the black people in the United States lived in the South, even if none of them could vote. And while no new ones would be coming in except in the unlikely event of the Confederacy reinstating the slave trade, more would be born, giving them a larger percentage of the population. While the black population of the United States likely attained something close to equality ahead of schedule, the much larger population in the Confederacy would be staring across the border with jealousy and anger. And when a population has nothing to gain from obedience, they have nothing to lose from rebellion. By the 20th century, the odds are large-scale slave rebellions would become more and more common, with the Confederacy fighting to keep them down.
And international support would be huge for those, for the slaves. It would be massive, especially from countries that have obviously abolished it, with large, black and ethnic minority populations.
The United States can put the screws to its unwelcome neighbor, including offering refuge to escaped blacks from the Confederacy or aiding efforts to sanction them. And slowly, a Confederacy with slavery might look a little like apartheid-era South Africa, isolated and desperately trying to hold on to a dying system.
This reminds me of the TV show The Handmaid's Tale. There's a lot of similarities there. I think that's what it would kind of look like.
And if it was to give in to that pressure, the future would look very different. The Confederacy would have a large black population that would likely all vote unanimously for equal rights candidates as soon as they were able to. And it probably wouldn't be long before they rallied behind one of their own. Many former slave owners would likely not be willing to live in this reformed country, so by the time the demographics shifted enough, it might actually wind up being a black-led country. Of course, people don't always take the hint. There's a good chance that the Confederacy might decide not to give up power. This would potentially trigger another war between the former states, reminiscent of the War of 1812's bloody Round 2. As it likely wouldn't stand much of a chance against the full force of world opinion and support, this would likely end with a much harsher version of Reconstruction. But one thing is for sure, the US would not be the superpower it is in this timeline. With a hostile country on its border, the US would definitely not be looking to get involved in foreign affairs as heavily. It's unlikely it would have been lured into the primarily European territorial conflict of World War I. World War II would be thornier, with the Confederacy potentially seeking out help from a country with suspiciously similar views about minorities. But the only thing that's certain is the United States today would look nothing like what it does today. And it's possible that the end of the war would have just been Act 1. How would today's USA be different if the South had won? Drop your theory.
Interesting. Even though it appears that, the USA would be not as bad as I initially thought it would be had the Confederates won the Civil War, it still would obviously be a way worse climate for minorities in particular, and not just minorities, to be honest, because there were plenty of white people that were on the side of, the abolishment of slavery for equal rights. So it wouldn't just be minorities who would be, let's put it lightly, not in favor of the current conditions. But, goes without saying that for someone like me, it would just be an absolute nightmare situation. It would be horrible. I cannot imagine not having, the liberty, the freedom to, do what I want, to make these videos, to go out wherever I please, to travel. It's just insane that, 3 lifetimes ago, that was the reality for Black people. It really is just like, whenever I think about it, it always is just like a wow type moment. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.